On Monday, June 24th, the Karen Read trial continued with day 30, the final day of testimony. On this day, the jury heard from 3 witnesses. They were Dr. Frank Sheridan, Dr. Daniel Wolfe, and Dr. Andrew Rentschler. Now, going into day 30, I had thought that the prosecution would be introducing at least one rebuttal witness. At the end of the day on Friday, I had seen something floating around Twitter and elsewhere on social media saying that the prosecution had moved to introduce another accident reconstruction expert. And so I thought that there would be at least some kind of discussion about that somewhere. I was also under the impression that Adam Lally would find an expert to rebut Dr. Marie Russell's testimony after Judge Cannone gave him that option due to Dr. Russell's late entry into the trial. However, after Dr. Rentschler was excused from the witness stand, I was surprised to hear from Judge Cannone that there was no more testimony to be heard in the trial. So this meant that the jury would hear closing arguments on the morning of day 31. And let me tell you, this was a huge win for the defense. Day 30 was unequivocally a very good day for the defense, and the fact that the jury was left at the very end, particularly with the last bit of testimony by Dr. Rentschler, was especially powerful. Watch until the end to hear why. Let's get into it. Okay, so up first was Dr. Frank Sheridan. He is a retired forensic pathologist who has had a very long, storied career. One thing that drew some, in my opinion, unsavory commentary from some people online was the fact that he seemed to have some breathing issues while testifying due to some kind of a medical condition. However, once you got past that and listened in, you could hear that he has had a very impressive career that took him from Dublin, Ireland to Central Africa to Hangzhou, China to the same hospital that Dr. Marie Russell worked at, LA County Hospital, USC Medical Center. He also worked at the LA County coroner for a while, and in his entire career, he estimates that he's testified maybe 400 times and done somewhere around 13,000 autopsies. He also estimated that around 3,000 of those autopsies were a result of automobile collisions, and around a dozen of the 13,000 also involved animal attacks. So, breathing issues aside, this was a great witness with clearly a wealth of knowledge. Anyway, so of course he was asked about John O'Keefe's injuries. Starting with the injuries to his right arm, Dr. Sheridan said that those were abrasions, friction injuries, which is consistent with what Dr. Scorbello said. He said they were also ante-mortem, meaning that they were inflicted before he died. He said that he could tell that because they were red as opposed to yellowish. And when he was asked if he could put a timestamp on when they were inflicted, he said that he couldn't give an exact time, but minutes to hours before his death would be accurate. Now, when asked, he also said that this did not look like it was from a motor vehicle strike at all. And the biggest reason that he said this was because in those cases, you'd expect to see bruising from the point of impact. And he said that the abrasions appear to be patterned. So there's this word again. Patterned. This word was used to describe these injuries by Dr. Scorbello, Dr. Russell, and now Dr. Sheridan. And Dr. Russell and Dr. Sheridan also both testified that they thought these injuries were consistent with an animal attack. In fact, Dr. Sheridan said that his initial reaction to seeing these injuries was that it most likely was from a dog. He pointed to the same spot that Dr. Russell did by the elbow and said that it looked like there was a bite mark there, but admittedly, he said that he wasn't totally sure. And then he pointed to the parallel marks on both edges of this overall pattern and said that those appeared to be claw marks to him. Now, when it came time to talk about the injuries to John's head, his testimony was very interesting. Similar to what Dr. Stonebridge and Dr. Scorbello said, he said that he thought that John died in large part from a blunt force to the back of his head. And I previously talked about how I loved Dr. Scorbello's testimony because while she used medical terminology that can oftentimes be a little bit too complex to a layperson, she still was able to break it down so that the average person could basically understand it. And this makes it most likely so that the jury would digest her testimony. However, I think Dr. Sheridan's testimony was even better because he described the injuries exclusively in layman's terms. So the jury didn't even need to use any mental calories to follow along with what he was saying. He basically said that the blow to the back of the head caused a fracture at the back of the skull, which traveled all the way around to the front of the skull. And he said that this blow also caused significant injuries to the brain itself. This included bleeding on the surface of the brain. And it also included contusions of the brain's substance itself, both to the side and the front of the brain. And he also said that the blunt force also caused a hemorrhage deep inside the brain. Because of these injuries, Dr. Sheridan said John's brain started to swell. This created herniation or pressure downwards towards the top of the spinal cord, and this ultimately would have led to respiratory failure. Dr. Sheridan clarified that John likely would have been breathing for a while, but that he would have been unconscious for sure. And so all of this so far is pretty consistent with Dr. Scortibello and Dr. Stonebridge. And what's more, Dr. Sheridan also echoed their testimony when he said that he couldn't tell exactly what would have struck John O'Keefe. He was asked, however, if that could happen because of the back of his head hitting dirt or grass or snow, even ice. And Dr. Sheridan said, no, it really needs to be a hard surface to create this kind of damage. And so when asked about whether the overall injuries on John O'Keefe's body were consistent with being hit by an SUV, Dr. Sheridan said no. And this was because there was no bruising on his torso, on his hips, etc., nor were there any injuries on his legs. Rather, Dr. Sheridan said that it was his opinion that these injuries are much more consistent with John O'Keefe being in a fight in at least a general sense. For that, he pointed to things like the scrape marks on his face, the laceration just above his right eyelid, and the bruise on the back of his hand, which he says looks like a defensive injury. Now, in cross-examination, Lally tried poking some holes in this. He pointed to the fact that all of John's injuries were to his right side, and Dr. Sheridan agreed. There were no injuries to John's left side, all of them were to the right. And Lally pointed out that there was, in fact, a bruise to John's lower extremity right next to his right knee. Dr. Sheridan agreed there, in fact, was a bruise there. Lally also asked Dr. Sheridan if it was normal for an animal to just attack one part of the body. And Dr. Sheridan gave a fairly full answer that basically summed up to, in a general sense, yes. Lally then asked if Dr. Sheridan had been shown anything about Terry Kuhn's work at the UC Davis Veterinary Lab and whether Dr. Sheridan knew that no dog DNA was found on John O'Keefe's clothing. Dr. Sheridan said that he actually wasn't aware of any of that. And that is something that the jury definitely will consider. They have to square the fact that no dog DNA was found on John O'Keefe with the fact that there are two defense experts saying that they see evidence in the injuries themselves showing a dog or a large animal did in fact attack John O'Keefe. Which one of those will be more convincing to the jury? Only time will tell. For my part, I can say that absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence. It is very hard to definitively prove that something doesn't exist, like canine DNA on John O'Keefe, unless you've gone down enough of that investigatory path to satisfy the questions. And the fact that the swabs used for the DNA test were taken only from John O'Keefe's clothing as opposed to his skin, for example, plus the fact that Terry Kuhn herself testified that dyes in fabrics can in fact interfere with the detection of DNA, there are still some potential questions that the jury may have about the DNA testing. And they may not have much faith in the evidence gathering overall by Canton PD and the Massachusetts State Police. But again, we'll have to see what they say eventually. Lally also asked Dr. Sheridan if it was possible that the injuries could come from a side swipe by the SUV. And Dr. Sheridan said that it could depend on John's positioning during the hypothetical side swipe, but still he would expect to see bruising. And he said that even if there was maybe some ice on the ground, that wouldn't be enough to fracture the back of his head in the way that it was fractured. And to that point, Lally emphasized that the fractures came from the back of the head, not the front, so this would mean that John couldn't have been punched in the face, right? Wrong, said Dr. Sheridan. According to the witness, a lack of fractures originating from the face doesn't rule out the possibility of a black eye from a punch. And here he also said something that was very different from Dr. Stonebridge and Dr. Scortibello, but which was really interesting. Dr. Sheridan pointed to the laceration above John's right eyelid, and he said that this is an injury that is separate from the injury to the back of the head, and it's not from a sharp object. If it were a sharp object, it wouldn't by definition be a laceration. And the fact that it was a laceration was something that he got from the medical reports from Dr. Stonebridge and Dr. Scortibello. So this cross-examination to me did not move the needle in favor of the prosecution's case. And then, what's more, Elizabeth Little got up to do her redirect, and it was probably the best redirect that I've seen in this trial so far. All she did was introduce, for the first time, the photo of the bruise to John's right knee. Now, before I show it, keep in mind, the prosecution has been referring to this bruise throughout the trial as evidence that John did in fact sustain an injury to his lower extremities from the SUV. And it's generally been referred to as a small bruise, but a bruise nonetheless. But it didn't occur to me until this moment in the trial that we had never actually seen a photo of the bruise. In my mind, it was small, But when they showed the jury the photo of this bruise, I basically died laughing, because how can anyone say with a serious face that this tiny little dot was caused by a 7,000-pound vehicle? Anyway, that was it for Dr. Sheridan. The next witness was Dr. Daniel Wolfe. If you watched the Day 27 live stream and or recap, you're familiar with Dr. Wolfe as an accident reconstructionist from ARCA Inc. Now, I didn't go into this when talking about the voir dire, but the chat really loved Dr. Wolfe, and it wasn't just because of his clearly impressive education and experience as an engineer.
Directly behind that was a pressurized vessel.
And looking at social media afterwards, it seems my chat's reaction wasn't exactly anomalous. In fact, the internet does seem to stand Dr. Wolfe pretty hard. But aside from this, he was also an incredibly impressive expert witness, and his testimony was very helpful to the defense. Here's what it was in a nutshell. First, Alan Jackson made it very clear that Dr. Wolfe, and Dr. Rentschler for that matter, was not hired by the defense team. His analysis and reporting, and that of Dr. Rentschler, was done completely independently of the defense. They were hired by a separate entity looking into this whole issue, and they hadn't even met the defense team or even heard of Karen Reed until right before trial. This is important because it means that the evidence that was provided to Dr. Wolfe and Dr. Rentschler was not provided by the defense. And the defense had no control over what actually was provided, what they looked at, or how they did their work. Either side in this trial could have called these witnesses, and the prosecution chose not to. And above all, these guys were not even getting paid to be there by the defense. Now, when it comes to expert witnesses, this is something that often juries will use to discount their testimony. They're hired guns, they're peddling a professional opinion that can be bought and sold. But here, this could eliminate a bit of that factor, so it'll be interesting to see how the jury takes their testimony. Anyway, Dr. Wolfe also said that the evidence that was provided, the photos taken from the scene, etc., it really wasn't enough for him to be able to step into the scene and get a real idea of what actually happened. In other words, there were serious gaps in the documentation of the evidence. Surprise, surprise. But aside from that, Dr. Wolfe said that he and Dr. Rentschler essentially worked in their separate respective areas of expertise, but collaborated on a couple experiments to answer a specific question. And for Dr. Wolfe's part, that question more or less was, what kind of force would create the damage observed to Karen's SUV? Along the way, Dr. Wolfe noted that there really wasn't significant damage to Karen's car. There was a taillight, some superficial scratches, and a small dent to the left of the passenger side taillight. But typically, what he sees in auto collisions is damage that is more extensive, like big dents to the paneling of the car, for example. And to be clear, he's talking about collisions also involving a pedestrian. That, along with the fact that only this isolated portion of the car had damage, was inconsistent with a pedestrian collision. So then, if this did not look like a pedestrian collision, what could it be? Dr. Wolfe testified that he and Dr. Rentschler looked at only the evidence that was found at the scene, the taillight pieces, the glass, the damage to the SUV, and the injuries to John O'Keefe. And so they posed this question: what if the taillight was damaged by the drinking glass and the drinking glass alone? Is that possible? What would that look like? So they used a bunch of magical math and sorcerer's science to put together a special pressurized air cannon to launch a similar glass at the same kind of taillight and see what kind of damage it would produce. He said that they set it to a target speed of 30 to 40 miles per hour, since Dr. Rentschler said that that is a reasonable speed for an adult male to throw an object. Ultimately, they ended up using 37 miles per hour, and they found that it got a similar result to what actually happened to Karen Reed's taillight. This was huge. It's a brand new theory than what the defense has been hinting at throughout the trial, but it brings in a completely reasonable and credible theory as to what may have happened to Karen's taillight. Now, in cross-examination, Lally also asked about whether Dr. Wolfe thought that Karen's taillight could be cracked at a very low speed by hitting John's car when she was backing out at 5 a.m. on January 29th, 2022. And Dr. Wolfe said, probably not. And so I saw people on social media who are very pro-prosecution saying that this absolutely killed the defense's case. And I have to say, I completely disagree. Remember, the burden of proof is on the prosecution, not on the defense. The defense's job is to present plausible and credible theories that introduce reasonable doubt about the prosecution's case. And the prosecution's case requires that they show Karen Reed murdered John O'Keefe beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution's burden requires them to have a central theory and a central narrative as to how and why this all happened, and it needs to hold up against other possibilities. So even if the jury says, well, the defense was pointing out this other theory before, but this theory, the one that suggests that John broke the taillight when he threw a glass at it on his way out of the car, for example, this actually makes the most sense. That doesn't really hurt the defense's case because they don't have to have a central theory other than there are so many possibilities that you can't say any one of them is more correct than another. Now, on top of the air cannon test, Dr. Wolfe also testified about a test that they did to indicate the force that was required to cause the damage to Karen's SUV that actually resulted. And the question was, could that match up with John O'Keefe's presence on the scene? In other words, could his body have done that? When they tested the possibility of a human head coming into contact with the taillight, this did not support the idea that John was hit by the car. For example, they tested the impact with a vehicle going in reverse at 15 miles per hour. And when they tested it with the presence of a crash dummy, and specifically the head of a crash dummy, the force that resulted to the taillight was way more significant than what Karen Reed's SUV actually had. And so he said if they modified the calculations for 24 miles per hour instead of 15 miles per hour, the damage to Karen's car would have been even more significant. So then Jackson asked him, well, what about a human arm? And Dr. Wolfe said that the human arm typically weighs about the same as a human head, so the force from the impact would be calculated to be the same. So all in all, the damage sustained to the taillight was inconsistent with striking a human head or a human arm. This is seriously damaging to the prosecution's case. Now, in cross-examination, Lally had a hard time combating the actual math and physics of the testimony. And so he basically resorted to throwing spaghetti at the wall. He asked, well, what about John O'Keefe's hair found in the bumper? And did you know that John O'Keefe's fingernails were scraped for DNA and they were found to only have his DNA? And what about the Toyota tech stream? Did you look at that? And as it turns out, none of that information was provided to Dr. Wolfe. However, none of that information changes anything in the math or physics of Dr. Wolfe's analysis. So in my opinion, anyway, this was an ineffective cross. But maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. Either way, let me know in the comments down below. Okay, so the last witness of the day, as well as the last witness of this trial as a whole, was Dr. Andrew Rentschler. As I already said, his testimony really went hand in hand with Dr. Wolfe's testimony since they basically collaborated on their testing of the SUV. But Dr. Rentschler's focus was on the biomechanics and the human element. In other words, looking at the injury in the human body and asking, how does this happen? And so his main focus was on the question, was there sufficient force to create these injuries to John O'Keefe? And he said right off the bat, at 24 miles per hour, which is the speed that the prosecution is saying Karen was going, Dr. Rentschler would expect to see fractures, ligament, and tendon damages to the body, as well as significant bruising. This is because the collision with a 7,000-pound vehicle would create upwards of 1,000 pounds of force on the body. So looking at the injury to the head, he said that this was inconsistent with getting hit at 24 miles per hour. He said that in order to get these injuries to the head, and basically only the head, as what happened with John O'Keefe, he'd have to be standing in a weird configuration when hit. But even still, you would also expect to see cervical spine injuries in connection with that impact. And that makes perfect sense. And he basically had the same conclusion for the arm injury. At 24 miles per hour, you would expect to see significant injury to the arm, including subcutaneous lacerations, bruising, and even fracturing of the bone. And then Jackson asked, well, what if he was hit in the arm? Could that project a person outward to the side? And Dr. Rentschler said, no, the force of the vehicle will overcome your muscular strength easily and just move your arm. In order to get a body to move over 10, 20, 30 feet, you need to have a force that hits somewhere in the center of mass. So essentially somewhere along the torso. And so if you were assuming that a body was struck at the center mass with enough force to move the body over a distance, you also would expect to see not just significant damage to the vehicle, but also injuries to the entire right side of the body from the contact with the vehicle, and injuries to the left side from contact with the ground afterward. And there would also likely be some kind of road rash on the entire left side from that contact. Now, in cross-examination, Lally floundered even more with Dr. Rentschler than he did with Dr. Wolfe. Early on cross, Jackson objected and asked for a sidebar. And I suspect that this objection was to basically call Lally out a bit for what he did with Dr. Wolfe, which was to ask a whole laundry list of questions that were clearly outside the scope of his testimony, just so that Lally could essentially make improper arguments to the jury. And when they returned from the sidebar, Judge Cannone asked Lally if he actually needed a minute before resuming his cross. Lally said no, but this definitely seemed to suggest that he was just thrown a huge curveball in what he planned to ask Dr. Rentschler. There was some awkward airtime as he flipped through pages of his notes, seeming to try to figure out what to do. And then the questions that followed ended up really just opening the door for Dr. Rentschler to continue making his conclusions from his analysis. And what resulted was Dr. Rentschler basically ended up dancing all over the prosecution's case by saying multiple times in multiple ways that there is no way to be able to conclude what exactly happened to John O'Keefe because there isn't enough evidence available to be able to make a determination like that. He literally said that the possibilities are basically infinite. Here's a clip of the last bit of testimony that the jury was left with in this entire trial, and I want you to tell me in the comments how many mic drops you can count from this clip to the very end.
Now, when you were talking about the injuries to the back of the head of Mr. O'Keefe, consistent with coming in contact with a hard surface, correct?
Yes, sir.
Would that hard surface include if the ground was frozen?
Well, you'd have to perform an analysis actually, because you'd have to determine how hard that ground was. You'd have to look at the freeze and thaw cycle, probably leading up to weeks of that. You can't just look at ground and say, well, it's below freezing, so that ground must be frozen. I mean, is it a possibility? It may be, but you have to go through an actual analysis and procedure to determine how hard that ground is and whether it could have produced those injuries.
So it is something that's capable of being done by you, is that correct?
Performing that type of an analysis?
Yes.
You could go through and do it, sure, yeah.
And you didn't do it, correct?
No, I did not do it, no. Because, yeah, there's no need in this case. We don't know what happened in this case. There's no indication of, certainly, it's not consistent with getting hit by the car and ending up where he did, even if the ground is somehow hard enough to cause that type of an injury. Again, there's no movement and no force to get his body over there, and the damage with the car is inconsistent with him being struck by it. So whether the ground could cause it or not, the roadway could cause it, the curb could cause it, a back could cause it. There's numerous different possibilities, and we don't really have enough evidence in this case to determine what one specific event actually caused that injury.
You didn't have enough evidence based on what you were provided. Isn't that fair to say?
I didn't have enough evidence based on what I was provided, and even looking at the additional evidence that I became aware of after the fact, there's still no evidence. I mean, you can't deny the science and the physics as to what would have happened if he was struck by the vehicle. So anything past that, you have to somehow overcome that hurdle, which is very difficult to do.
When was it that you looked at this additional material, and who provided it to you?
We were informed after a report was issued that DNA was found. And that was really the primary issue. I believe that some DNA was found on the housing, which, again, there's numerous explanations or ways that DNA can get on a light housing.
Well, let me ask you this, sir. With regard to the materials that you were provided with, was there anything in there that stated that Mr. O'Keefe's skull fracture on the back of his head was caused by contact with the tail light?
No, I don't believe there was anything in those materials that stated that.
Is there anything in those materials that indicated or that anyone stated at any point in time that Mr. O'Keefe's arm was outstretched at the time that he was struck by the vehicle?
No, sir, there wasn't.
Was there anything in there indicating that his arm was tucked in at the time that he was struck by the vehicle?
You know, there's no indication in any of that evidence of what he may or may not have been doing, how he may or may not have been positioned. I mean, that's the whole issue. There's no evidence to indicate what may have allegedly occurred in this case.
Now, a typical pedestrian collision that you see through the course of your work involves a pedestrian being struck by the front of a vehicle. Is that fair to say?
I see all types of different people getting run over backwards, cars spinning, hitting sideways, frontal impacts certainly occur, yes, but we see pedestrians getting struck by all parts of the vehicle.
I'm sure you see all kinds. What I'm asking is predominantly when you see a pedestrian collision, the typical pedestrian collision would be a pedestrian crossing a road in front of a vehicle as it's approaching. Is that correct?
That's certainly not uncommon, yes, sir.
Now, as far as, I believe you described a little bit on your direct testimony as far as there be There's differences in the type of injuries that you would expect or anticipate depending on how the vehicle interacted with the pedestrian in a pedestrian collision, correct?
Yes, sir.
And as far as, you familiar with what's called a sideswipe collision?
Yes, sir, I am.
And am I correct when I say that in a typical pedestrian collision with a pedestrian crossing in front of a vehicle, there are a number of different types of interactions as far as a wrap and a forward projection versus a fender vault versus a number of different ways that a pedestrian can interact with the front of a vehicle, correct?
It depends on the position of the pedestrian and certainly the profile of that vehicle and the speed of the vehicle. Yes, sir. There's many different factors involved in it.
And so in a typical pedestrian collision, when a pedestrian is struck by the front of the vehicle, that involves more of an assumption of the velocity of the striking motor vehicle by the pedestrian than you would expect to see in a sideswipe collision, correct?
Well, I mean, yes, generally speaking, a sideswipe means that the person or the pedestrian in the vehicle don't obtain a similar or common velocity. So if you're standing in front of a car and it hits you, it's going to speed you up to that same speed and then disengage. The sideswipe means that there's not this mass-to-mass impact. By its very nature, sideswipe has minimal forces. We see it even between vehicles that just rub against each other. So if there's a sideswipe impact with a pedestrian in a vehicle, there's going to be very little damage to the pedestrian. And similarly, there's going to be very little movement. There's really no force at all acting. You know, for instance, if a car came and swiped by your arm, but didn't have enough force or enough contact to cause any damage, well, it wouldn't actually cause any movement of the person either. So a sideswipe by its very nature involves minimal impact, minimal forces, minimal velocities.
And also contained with in the report that you at least co-authored, there's an indication that Mr. O'Keefe's injuries, at least to his skull, the fracture to his skull, are consistent with him having been pushed or possibly been impacted by the subject Lexus and fallen backwards, striking his head. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, so that's another possibility.
Sorry, sir, yes or no?
No, let him answer. Let him answer the question.
So if we're saying that there's enough force if you fall backwards to strike your head and cause that skull fracture, well, he could have slipped and struck his head. The car could have backed up and not known that he was there and nudged him and caused him to fall. I mean, any event that would cause him to fall backwards obviously would result in him striking his head. So there's numerous, almost infinite possibility of different scenarios that could result in that type of an event.
So that was it for trial. Immediately following this, Judge Cannone told the jury that they'd be coming back the next morning for closing arguments. And so here we are at basically just about the end of trial. To me, I don't see how this ends in a conviction based on all of the evidence that's been presented here. In fact, I don't see how this case even made it to trial in the first place. But the jury can always disagree with me, and if they do, it'll be interesting to see what they found most compelling to convince them in this case. If they do convict, I suspect that a lot of it would have to do with them being convinced that Karen Reed made an admission that she hit John. I personally don't see that to be the case here based on my own analysis, but it is helpful to understand why that might be convincing to someone else when we're looking at cases like this. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? After hearing about all of the evidence in this case, do you think that Karen Reed is guilty of murder? Or do you think that she should be acquitted? If so, tell me why in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more of the final coverage of the Karen Reed trial, both in these daily recaps and in the Gavel to Gavel live streaming, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is out. And if you really want to support the content, consider becoming a member of Bike Club. You can join either through YouTube memberships or by becoming a supporter on Patreon, and doing so means that over the long term of this channel, we can continue to devote intensive resources to trials like this one and other interesting legal topics. Links to both are in the description below. Otherwise, see you on day 31 for closing arguments.